thank you all, and it's good to be here in the Neve Shalom Synagogue. This issue is very emotional and controversial, and it's not always my privilege to be in a synagogue. So you know, it means a lot to me to be able to be here. You know, I was scheduled to speak in the Jewish Federation in Salt Lake City, of all places. Salt Lake City has a Jewish community, and you know, they always joke that if you really want to be a Gentile, go to Salt Lake City, because the Jews there are Gentiles. So I was scheduled to speak in the Federation, and then we arrived, and the Federation discovered who I was too late to cancel. So I got there, and they basically wouldn't let me in. Okay. The next year I came back to Salt Lake City, and a Jewish group there had organized for me to speak in one of the Jewish schools. And at the last minute that was canceled with pressures from whoever in the Jewish community. So one of the members of the Jewish community, a very prominent doctor, very prominent in the community, basically called the leaders of the Jewish community into his home for a meeting. I was there. And he's prominent enough that they couldn't say no to him. And he brought in the leaders of the Federation, he brought in the Hillel people from the different universities, he brought in rabbis from the various synagogues, with the question, and this was really, I thought, brilliant. The question he posed to them was, why can't we talk about Israel? Why can't we talk about Israel? Why can't Jeff Halper, who is today an Israeli, I've been in Israel now for 35 years, why can't Jeff Halper speak in the Jewish, but not just Jeff Halper, anybody with a peace message can't. Because of course, I'm not balanced, and I'm, you know, all that. Well, that's probably true, but my presentation isn't balanced. And at the same time, of course, in the Jewish federations and so on, Daniel Pipes can speak. You know, people that Netanyahu can speak in Vancouver. In other words, people that represent the right wing and even an Islamophobic position can speak freely in the Jewish community. But people that come with a more nuanced message of peace are locked out. And that, I thought, was an interesting way to approach it. The question is, why can't we talk about Israel? And what I want to start with is kind of a funny thing to say. But, you know, Israel is a real country. You know, it's not just a construct. It's not just a projection of the Jewish community here. It isn't Leon Uris and Exodus. And it never was. It isn't Golda Meir. It isn't the kibbutz. It isn't a lot of blonde-haired farmers and so on. Israel's a real country. There's all kinds of people living there. You know, the Jewish majority is now only 70% in Israel. So 30% of Israelis are not Jewish. It's a very vibrant country, it's a very conflicted country, it's a very interesting country, very dynamic. And I say that because people don't want to relate to Israel as a real place. And I think if I can say this in terms of the Jewish community, I think in a sense one reason why it's very hard to engage with the Jewish community on this issue isn't because of the issue itself. I think most American Jews want peace. They want good for Israel. I don't think they want the settlements. I don't think they want the occupation. I don't think that's the issue. The issue is that Israel and Zionism did a real disservice to the Jewish people, I think. And that is, you know, in the Holocaust, a lot of the Jewish life of the diaspora was destroyed. And in that kind of a vacuum, Zionism arose as a very strong force. before World War II, Zionism was not an accepted force, as you well know. In the Reform, for example, Reform and conservative communities, Jewish communities in the United States, they were anti-Zionist up until 1948 and many after 1948. Even in the very beginning, you know, Theodor Herzl, why was the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland? Because the Jewish community in Zurich wouldn't allow it to be in Zurich. The Jewish community never, ever really supported Zionism. And I would say that until today, 75%, you know, the revolution of Zionism was to redefine the Jewish people as a nation, like the French nation, like the British nation, like the Russians, the Chinese. In other words, nations that have rights of self-determination. And that's the basis of being Israeli. But the vast, vast majority of Jews never went there. You know, only 1% of American Jews ever went to Israel, moved to Israel. As a matter of fact, before this birthright program, where we have to bring young people to Israel for free, or else they won't come, 85% of American Jews had never visited Israel. In other words, there's a very interesting paradox here that the real country of Israel is not of great interest to American Jews, or even to Jews outside. In some ways, it is a foreign country. But at the same time, I think what happened with the destruction of European Jewry was that Zionism kind of leaped into the breach. It was the only real organized Jewish movement in many ways. And you know, again, many of the Jews in this country that didn't go through the Holocaust, you know, were socialists, communists. I mean, without the Jews, there wouldn't have been a communist party, probably here or anywhere else in the world. You know, and then after World War II, and especially in the 50s with the rise of McCarthyism and so on, that whole Jewish leftist tradition was also suppressed. So you had the suppression of the Jewish world of Europe, or the destruction of the Jewish world of Europe, and the suppression of one of the major expressions of Jewish social conscience in the West, and in the United States in particular, which was socialism and communism and radical social movements. And so Zionism kind of filled that breach. But Zionism, one part of Zionism, there's an element of Zionism that's what's called the negation of the exile. In other words, Jews that live in this country, including my parents, for example, I don't think see themselves as living in exile. My parents are living in a diaspora, maybe, but they're Americans. And they're American Jews. And they're proud of being Jewish and so on. And Judaism has different expressions, but they're Americans. But what Israel told Jews in the diaspora was, your life is ephemeral in the exile. You're living in other people's countries. Your life has no meaning whatsoever outside of Israel. There's no Jewish culture, certainly not Yiddish. You know, Israel was hostile towards Yiddish. Do you know that after the Holocaust, there were many very famous Yiddish actors that survived, that came to Israel? Do you know that into the 1960s, the late 1960s, it was illegal in Israel to perform a play in Yiddish? You would be arrested. And they had a very vibrant Yiddish theater in Israel. And what did they do? They would advertise a play at 8 o'clock, and all the Yiddish-speaking Jews knew that the play was really going to be on at 6. And by the time the police came at 8 to arrest everybody, the play would be over. You know, and this was in Israel. There was a tremendous hostility, and you still have remnants of that today. A hostility to anything that reeked of the diaspora, the exile, ghettos, Jews living in other people's countries, anything that wasn't Zionistic. And I think what happened was that the Jews here in the United States, in Europe, in the rest of the world after World War II, began to adopt an Israel-centric definition of Judaism. In other words, to some degree they accepted that, partly because there were very few alternatives, because again, Jewish life had been destroyed in its traditional heartlands. And so you began to have a vicarious identification of Judaism with Israel. And Israel became, you know, the linchpin of American, and not only American, but largely American Jewish identity, so that everything was galvanized around Israel. And this is where the Jewish community found its meaning and was able to organize. So that, and the Israel that they constructed as this center pin of their lives was a very idealized Israel. It was an Israel of Golda Meir, an Israel of Exodus and Leon Uris. I think Exodus was probably the greatest PR piece in the history of advertising. I mean, in our generation at least, I don't think there was one person, not only here, but in Europe, in Latin America, that didn't read Exodus at the age of 16. It absolutely formed the image. And then, of course, the movie, starring Paul Newman, with music by Henry Mancini, sung by Andy Williams. I mean, you can't get much more American than that. And Israel became a part of American popular culture. And you have this until today. Israel plays on that. I mean, just this meeting that's going to be held in Vancouver sometime soon. Convergence between that Israel and the United States are really two faces of the same entity, in a sense. You have all of that. But the Jewish community then developed a dependency on this idealized image of Israel. And not only that, not only idealized, but besieged, beleaguered. Because an Israel that wasn't threatened was really of no use from the point of view of galvanizing. What are you going to galvanize around? A country at peace? You know, and so I think the Jewish community here, and Israel played on that as well, needed the conflict. Now, in the last war, in the Lebanese war last summer, the American Jewish community raised $330 million to reconstruct the north of Israel. Just that very, and I'm sure here in Portland there was all kinds of organization, just that very enterprise of getting Jews to rally for Israel and presenting Israel as this little country that's fighting for its existence. And of course, after 9/11, the terrorists and the bad guys. And this, in a sense, is what provides that modicum of Judaism, of Jewish identity with Israel for Jews abroad, Jews in this country. Because the Jews here aren't really Israelis. I mean, many of them haven't been there. But Israel plays that key role as a linchpin. Because who are the Jews here? The Jews are white middle-class people. And without an Israel to galvanize around, a beleaguered but idealized Israel, the whole center of their lives, I think, disperse. You know, and you get even more assimilation, or the threat of assimilation that you have today. I think it's changing. I think there's beginning to be a vibrant Jewish culture that's starting to assert itself again. I know they have a Jewish music festival in San Francisco. Klezmer music is becoming important. There's Yiddish studies. More people are going back to Yiddish studies. I think there is beginning to be the rise, especially as Jews find it very hard to identify with Israeli policies and so on. I think the Jews of the diaspora are beginning to find new sources of meaning and new sources of culture. So when I come to speak, and this is why we can't talk about Israel, because when I come to speak, I don't think it's my message that's the problem. I think and you know what, I have secret meetings with rabbis all the time, honestly. The rabbis will call me and say, you know, can we meet in Starbucks somewhere? And I'm not going to get into why we shouldn't meet in Starbucks, but all right, fine, if that's where you want to sit. And I get meetings with 4 or 5. I just had a meeting a couple of weeks ago on the highway between Ann Arbor and Detroit. 5 rabbis wanted to meet me in the Starbucks, clandestinely, because they can't have me in their synagogues. So they say to me, we want you to know that you really give us moral strength. We appreciate what you're saying. And I say to them, but wait a minute, I mean, you're the rabbis. I'm not the rabbi of the rabbis. You're supposed to be giving me moral strength. You're supposed to be giving me moral leadership. I mean, where's your job description? And that's part of the problem as well, is that there really is a lack of leadership, I think, on the part of rabbis, and certainly the federations and what we call the organized Jewish community. So that, I think, is the problem. And I ask you to kind of disconnect, those of you who are Jewish here, and that is that I'm talking today about a real country. I'm not talking about the country the Jews need, the idealized image that they need to keep their community together. That's your agenda. That's completely legitimate in terms of the needs of the American Jews as an ethnic community, to have that kind of Israel as a sort of a linchpin of your identity. But it is not fair to Israel to try to represent Israel or to try to affect policy in terms of Israel based on that idealized image. Israel is not going to win in any conflict with the Palestinians or the Arab world. Israelis are not going to be thrown into the sea, and they're not going to throw the Arabs into the desert. We've got to find our place in the Middle East. And I have 2 messages for American Jews. One is get a life. In other words, Israel is fine, but you can't have another country. And Israel is another country. You can't have another country as the basis of your identity here. You've got to develop a vibrant diaspora Jewish culture in which Israel plays a role, for sure. But it can't be the vicarious center of your life. And my other message is, let Israel go. You cannot hold Israel in the straitjacket of some Leon Uris fantasy and expect it to continue to fight the Arabs, to support policies that only lead to more and more conflict, basically to end up supporting right-wing policies that the Israelis themselves don't support. There's no one more critical of AIPAC, of the American Jewish Israeli lobby in Washington, than the Israeli press. The Israeli press, the Israeli people think AIPAC is terrible because it's not representing Israel. It's representing some very thin segment of an extreme right-wing kind of an opinion within Israel. And you see that in this conference that's going to be, again, here in Vancouver. So you've got to let Israel go. It's a real country. It's changing. It's evolving. People ask me, am I a Zionist? I say, that's irrelevant for me now. I'm an Israeli. We call ourselves the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. I'm Israeli. In other words, I live in a country. Zionism was one element, and it is one element in Israeli society. Zionism is an ideology, it has a history, it has symbols, it has heroes, it has music. There's a lot of things connected to Zionism, but it doesn't define Israel. Again, 30% of Israelis are not Jewish. Of those that are Jewish, a good number, especially the ultra-Orthodox Jews, are not Zionist. And Zionist means a million things. For young Israelis, Zionism means nothing. They would never define themselves as Zionists. My kids don't even define themselves as Jews. They're Israelis. They're Israelis. And if you say to most young Israeli people, are you a Zionist? I mean, it's a weird question. You know, it's like saying to your kids, are you Jeffersonian Democrats? You know, what? What are you talking? Zionism for young Israelis means goody-goody. In other words, and this is true, this is the way it's used by kids. If you say to your kids, mind your manners, be in at 10 o'clock, and don't eat too much chocolate, the kids will say, don't talk Zionism to me. So that Israel has matured. It's 60 years now. You know, and it's a country that's developed, and it has a right to develop. It has a right to evolve in ways that maybe you don't approve of. Maybe Zionism never foresaw, but it has a right to do that as a country. You know, who would have foreseen in 1948 that 75% of the Palestinians would flee or be driven out of the country? Regardless of what the plans were, it did surprise the Israeli government when that happened. Who would have thought that 75% of the world's Jews would never come to Israel? Who would have thought that 1% of American Jews only would come to Israel? Who would have thought, you know, that with the Russian immigration, we have today about 300,000 to 400,000 Russian Israelis who aren't Jewish and who have no intention of becoming Jewish? Who could have predicted 1967 and the occupation, where now, as I'll show you in a minute, now we're saddled with another 4 million Palestinians that we can't get rid of. We can't incorporate them, we can't throw them out, you know, and which is raising the specter for many Israelis of one state that we've created ourselves, which is certainly not where the Zionist movement wanted to go, if they wanted a Jewish state. Who could have predicted even that the whole concept of a Jewish state that might have made sense 60 years ago has become very problematic, if not racist, in the 21st century? Can you really create an ethnically pure state in a region of the world that was highly populated before we arrived? There are some real questions here that Israel has to deal with, and you have to support, if you want to support Israel, you have to support its right to struggle with these questions. And essentially, I would also say, forget about sides. We are not, the Palestinians are not our enemies. As a matter of fact, one of the main slogans of the Israeli peace movement is, we refuse to be enemies. You are not going to make the Palestinians my enemy. Rather, the best way to look at this is to say, we're all in this mess together. We're not going to get rid of the Palestinians, they're not going to get rid of us. We're all in this mess together. How do we get out of it together? It's got to be a win-win equation. And that would be a tremendous contribution that the American Jewish community could make, is to create real dialogue between Israelis and Palestinians, to encourage policies of the United States really intended to resolve the conflict, and not to be defensive, and not to defend policies of Israel that not only don't you agree with, really, in your heart of hearts, but that are counterproductive to Israeli interests, and even Israelis don't support. In all the polls, 70% of the Israeli Jews want an end to the occupation. They don't want the settlements. They don't want the greater land of Israel. So why do we have an AIPAC and a Jewish Federation and spokespeople here that support those kinds of policies against, I believe, what most American Jews want, and certainly against what most Israeli Jews want? So just to start like that, to sort of say that we've got to relate to Israel as a real country. And I'm saying this partly because what I'm going to say tonight is very critical of Israel. But you know, you're critical of your own country. I mean, you're all critical, I would hope, of the United States. You know, and I'm critical of Israel. That isn't a good thing if Israel is this idealized image and I'm the messenger coming and cracking that image, and now what do you have as the center of your life? Then I'm a threat. But if you look at Israel as a real country and you really want to help it get out of the mess, then I think my message has to be evaluated. You know, it might not be balanced, it might not be what you agree with, it might be whatever, but there's elements in here that you have to take into account. So I'm speaking to you as an Israeli coming from a real country that really needs help, especially from the United States, which is the main supporter of the Israeli occupation. We really need help of progressive elements in the United States, and especially the Jewish community, to get us out of this mess, together with the Palestinians. Now, I don't want to take a super amount of time to talk, but nevertheless, you know, I think there are some issues that I want to bring up. One of which is this issue of reframing the conflict, because I think there's you know, when you're trying to address an issue, the issue of framing becomes very important. It isn't only a matter of my information against your information. It's a matter of how do you package it, how do you present it, what are the assumptions, what are the terms we're using, what are the issues we're talking about. Because as I'll show you how you frame a conflict, there's a logic to it that leads to a particular set of conclusions. And so I want to present to you the Israeli framing, the way it's usually framed, and counter and juxtapose it with a human rights reframing. Now, just to begin, this is a map of what we call the two-state solution. I hope I'm not blocking people too much. This is the two-state solution. This isn't exactly a widescreen Cinerama production here, but the two-state solution that's pretty much accepted by the international community. And we can ask ourselves, especially if we're pro-Israel, whatever that means, what's wrong with this map? What's wrong with this map? The two-state solution that is accepted by the international community, that's based on UN Resolution 242, that was adopted right after the Six-Day War in '67, and that follows through and is the basis of the roadmap initiative today that the United States is supposed to be leading, is all based on the two-state solution idea. That is a Palestinian state alongside the state of Israel. Now, the two-state solution, as you can see, is not really a fair one. If Israelis and Palestinians agree on anything, it's that this is one country. We call it the land of Israel, the Palestinians call it Palestine, but the borders are basically the Mediterranean up to the Jordan River. This is one country. And in this country today, half the population is Palestinian. So that in the two-state solution, that is the accepted solution, Israel is on 78% of the country. The occupied territories that we're talking of, that the Palestinians are asking become a Palestinian state, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, make up only 22% of the country. So that it's not a fair solution. One people, which is half the population today before refugees return, gets less than a quarter of the land. But in 1988, 5 years before the Oslo peace process, the PLO officially and publicly accepted the two-state solution in Algiers when the Palestinians declared their independence. The PLO accepted what we call the Green Line, the 1949 Armistice Line, and gave up political claim to 78% of Palestine. So since 1988, this has been the solution accepted by the Palestinians, and this was, of course, the basis on which they went into the Oslo agreements. The two-state solution was also accepted by the Arab League in 2002 in what we call the Saudi Initiative, that's only now coming back and being discussed. Last month there was a meeting in Riyadh, and now everybody's talking about the Saudi Initiative, although the Saudi Initiative is already 5 years old. And what the Arab League said in 2002 was that if Israel gives up the occupied territories, we will not only make peace with Israel, we won't only recognize Israel, but we will integrate Israel into the region. So there's a question here. Wait a minute. If the problem is security, Israeli security, or peace and security, then why didn't Israel grab at these offers 20 years ago? What's going on here? And what we're trying to say is, wait, there's something else going on. Israel could have had peace and security 20 years ago. Certainly in the 7 years of Oslo that could have happened. In 2002 that could have happened. It not only didn't Israel respond, it didn't explore, it didn't even treat these offers seriously, which raises some serious questions. Now, not only is this two-state solution accepted by the international community and by the Palestinians and by the Arab League, but it's accepted, as I said, by most Israelis. Most Israelis today say, yes, we can live with the two-state solution. Israelis see the occupation as an albatross around their neck, and they want separation. That's what the wall means for them. When Barak was elected in 1999, he was elected on the slogan, us here, them there. Now, it was a problem because a lot of them are here and a lot of us are there, but nevertheless, separation is really what the Israeli public wants. So it seems like we have universal consensus on this. But what's the problem? Why can't tomorrow morning we sit down and sign the deal? Because successive Israeli governments are the ones that have said no. We have to retain control of this entire country, and we cannot give the Palestinians a viable state. This is an Israeli government decision, and it's a decision that is really disconnected from the wants of even the Israeli population. So what Israel has basically done is create what I call a matrix of control over the occupied territories that make it impossible to detach them from Israel. Now, if I ask the question, wait a minute, if Israel wanted peace and security, and it could have had that, why didn't it grab those opportunities? So the question is, well, what does Israel want? What's underlying Israeli policy? And this is part of the Israeli framing. There's a part of the Israeli framing, the Israeli reality, that is not articulated, that people don't know, and is especially not articulated to the Jewish community, because it stands in absolute opposition to the values that Jews in this country hold. And that is the idea of exclusivity. Without getting into a whole lecture about that, when Zionism emerged as a national movement in the late 19th century, it emerged in Russia, in Eastern Europe, and in Central Europe. These were parts of the world, of Europe, that had a kind of a nationalism that we might call tribal nationalism. You didn't have the idea of a state, or of a civil society, or citizenship. You don't have that until today in Russia, for example. The whole idea of ethnic cleansing comes out of Yugoslavia. You know, the Jews lived for 1,000 years in Europe, in Russia, and were never ever seen as Russians. It's very tribal. And it stands in stark contrast to the nationalism that emerged in Western Europe, of which the United States is a part, in the late 18th century, early 19th century, with the French Revolution, British democracy, you know, in Western Europe, and of course the American Constitution and so on. American, let's say, and Western European nationalism is a civil nationalism. It's based on the idea of a state, and the state belongs to all its people. Now, we know there's racism. We know that Jefferson was a slave owner. We know that women didn't get the vote until the 1920s. I mean, we know all these things until today, discrimination and so on. Nevertheless, that's the conception of Western nationalism, that a state belongs to all its citizens. That is not the conception in Eastern and traditionally in Central Europe. In Eastern Europe, the nationalism was pan-Slavism. And if you weren't a Slav, you were outside of it. You weren't a part of it. In Central Europe, it was pan-Germanic culture that led to, you know, that led to the Nazis, and then afterwards, I think the Germans made a very dramatic turn towards a Western type of nationalism. But Theodor Herzl was very much a part of the Germanic culture. He wanted a Zionism. He saw a Zionism for Jews of Eastern Europe as a place of refuge, but he was a German, an Austrian German. He would never have thought in a million. He came to Palestine in 1898 for about a week and ran back as fast as he could to Vienna. So this is the kind of nationalism that Zionism adopted. I mean, if 90% of the Jews live in Russia towards the end of the 19th century, as they're developing their national identity, they're not going to jump to some Jeffersonian democracy. They took the form of tribal nationalism that they knew in Russia, or they knew in Germany, Austria, and they brought that, they imported that into Palestine as the Zionist national ideology. And that says, and that is until today the underlying assumption, worldview of Israeli Jews. That is that the land of Israel, we don't talk in Israel about the state of Israel very much. We talk about the land of Israel because it's our turf. We don't want borders. Israel's about the only country in the world that has no borders, because we want as much of the land as possible. The most liberal newspaper in Israel is called Haaretz, which is the land. So the land of Israel belongs exclusively to the Jewish people. This is the basis of Zionism, and this has been absorbed by the Israeli public. Even Israeli Jews that don't want the occupation nevertheless accept this idea that this is our land, and if we're going to give up some of our land to the Arabs, we're going to decide what land. We're not going to negotiate. They have no rights, because the other side of the coin is that Arabs, and I say Arabs because in Israel we don't use the word Palestinian. Sometimes, but not normally, the word Palestinian, because it gives too much recognition and distinctiveness and legitimacy to a collectivity with competing rights and claims to ours in our country. So we talk about Arabs. There's a bunch of Arabs in the country, but they don't add up to a collectivity with national rights like ours. So Arabs reside in our country by sufferance and not by right. They have no right to be in the land of Israel. And if they shut up, and if they mind themselves, and they're not uppity, and they know their place, they can stay. Otherwise, we'll throw them out. And this is exactly the message of Avigdor Lieberman, who is a senior minister in the Olmert government. He's the minister, he's really the minister for attacking Iran. That's his portfolio, is planning the attack on Iran. And he comes from a party that officially and openly talks about the transfer of Arabs out of the country. And by out of the country, Lieberman doesn't mean the occupied territories, only he means Israel as well. So Israel, rather than being a democracy, the alternative term, it's a very jargony term, but it's useful, is an ethnocracy. Israel is an ethnocracy. An ethnocracy is a country that belongs to one particular group, and that group is privileged over all the others. And I'm saying this because you can't understand the logic of Israeli policy. You can't understand why in the hell are they building settlements if most of the Israelis want to get rid of the occupation. You can't understand why they haven't exploited all kinds of opportunities for peace since 1948 unless you understand this underlying worldview and ideology. And one reason why it's not articulated is because I think it's absolutely contradictory to the values of American Jews. I mean, if this was ever really said, I mean, what American Jew could support the concept of Israel, let alone the policies of Israel? I mean, can we really accept the idea of an ethnically exclusive country that privileges itself over others? This is exactly what the Jews of this country fought for most of the years that we've been here. And this is an unarticulated part of the framing that nevertheless is crucial to understand. So as an alternative, we present a human rights framing that says, no, there are two peoples that reside in where? We can't say the land of Israel because that's an exclusive term. We can't say Palestine because that's an exclusive term. So it's awkward, but we say there are two peoples that reside in Israel-Palestine. Right now it's hyphenated, and each has a right to self-determination. That's the basis, the very different basis that we come from in the Israeli peace camp from that of the Zionist framing and where the Zionist movement is coming from. All right, now why is this important? Because the framing, like I said, determines where you're going. If you think Israel is a country that should be exclusively Jewish and Arabs have no place there, it's going to be hard for you to get to a two-state solution or a just solution. If, on the other hand, you accept the human rights framing and you say there are two peoples with rights living in this country, you're not going to get to apartheid or transfer or ethnic cleansing. So the framing is crucial for where you get to in terms of where you're going with this. So just now, we come to the second part of the Israeli framing, which is the conflict. And this is the part that is articulated. This is the part that you'll find in all the federation material and all the so-called pro-Israel materials that you find around. This is the Israeli framing, based on what we just said, but starting here, not articulating what we just said. And that is a security framing, where it's based on security, which is a very powerful way to frame it, that basically says Israel is fighting for its existence. It's a win-lose proposition. Either we win or they do. There's sides, and we're fighting for our existence. Now, if that's true, then we should build a wall 50 feet high, not 26 feet high. In other words, if it's true that we're fighting for our existence, then really Israel needs a strong army, it's defending itself, and so on. Okay. Going from that, then, if it's true that Israel's fighting for its existence, then the idea is that Israel's policies are based solely on concerns of security. We're just defending ourselves from terrorists. The Arabs don't want peace. That's clear because they're fighting us all. We want peace and they're fighting us. And the Palestinians in particular are our enemies. Now there's a good grain of truth to that. Because if in fact Israel is a country, Israel is the land of Israel that belongs exclusively to the Jews and Arabs have no rights there, well, then the Arabs are going to be our enemies. I mean, the Arabs can't possibly accept this kind of a formulation. The Arabs are our enemies. The Palestinians are our enemies, not because they're really our enemies, but because we've framed or we've constructed a kind of a country in which they're completely excluded. So this makes sense. And in fact, it's true to some degree, but it's true because of our construct, not because of the Arabs themselves. They're not to blame. We've set up this kind of a situation that is absolutely unacceptable, obviously, to the Arabs and Palestinians in the country. And therefore, the problem is Arab terrorism, because all resistance is seen as terrorism, and terrorism, of course, is a great word to use as well. And this is crucial, there is no occupation. You will never, ever, ever hear a so-called pro-Israeli speaker use the word occupation. First of all, Israel denies that it has an occupation, and second of all, the word isn't used because Israel tries to depoliticize the conflict. And in a sense, it does exactly what Bush does. It tries to mystify it. It tries to present the conflict as us and them, good and evil. There's no partner for peace. You can't talk to the Arabs. The Arabs are our enemies. Islam, all this kind of stuff. And so if you take the occupation out of the equation and you reduce everything to terrorism, then you have a very clear, persuasive, black and white sort of a framing. And not only is there no occupation, of course, but there are no Palestinians at all. So what Israel's done over the years, in order to make this ideology and to make this policy thrust irreversible, is to create facts on the ground. Facts on the ground that are immune to diplomacy. In 1977, when Begin was elected Prime Minister, Sharon was appointed the head of the Ministerial Committee on Settlements. And Begin charged Sharon with two things. First of all, to create facts on the ground that are so massive, so permanent, that Judea and Samaria, as we call the West Bank, will be irreversibly incorporated into Israel. It will be impossible to detach Judea and Samaria from Israel proper. And second of all, to foreclose forever any possibility of a viable Palestinian state. And Sharon, with the complete complicity of the Labour Party, had 30-some years to do this, with unlimited funds, many of them, of course, American funds. And Israel has created this matrix of control, and I'll just be real brief, that has 5 elements to it. First of all the Palestinians have been confined to these islands on the map, what we call areas A and B. The dark brown areas are the areas around the major Palestinian cities where more than 80% of the Palestinians live. They make up 18% of the West Bank. And that's the area supposedly under Palestinian control of the Palestinian Authority, even though we know that Israel invades it at will. But it's a fiction, but nevertheless. So we can say that after 7 years of negotiations in Oslo, from 1993 to 2000, all the Palestinians eked out of Israel was 18% of 22% of a small country. And that divided into dozens of islands. If we take Area A under Palestinian control and Area B, the lighter brown areas, which are under Palestinian civil control, schools and municipalities and so on, but under Israeli military control, the Palestinians live today in more than 70 islands in the West Bank and Gaza. And just to put it into perspective, you know, the occupied territories are an area the size of Delaware. with about 5 times the population of Delaware. So imagine 5 times the population of Delaware confined to less than half the area of Delaware, and then shatter that into 70 different islands. And you begin to get a sense of the realities that Palestinians live in. In addition to that, and then you have Area C, all the gray area around 58% of the West Bank, which is all controlled by Israel. And here's where the settlements are. Maybe, I hope you can see it, but all these blue blotches, more than 300 settlements. 500,000 Israelis live in the occupied territories, in what we call Area C, that completely surrounds all the Palestinian islands. The second element in the matrix of control is what we call the closure. Israel, at the beginning of the Oslo peace process, Israel imposed an economic closure on the Palestinian territories that exists until today. In other words, from 1967 till 1993, including the period of the First Intifada, Palestinians had free access to the entire country of Israel. They could work in Tel Aviv, they could take their kids to the beach, they could worship in the mosques and churches in Jerusalem. There were no restrictions whatsoever. Only with the beginning of the Oslo peace process, when there was no particular peak of terrorism, we're in a peace process, does Israel impose a systematic and ever-tightening closure over the occupied territories. Why? I mean, I have some ideas, but it's really hard to explain why. If Israel really wanted peace, if it was really in a peace process, why it would do that and impoverish the Palestinian society. You know, between 1967 and 93, Israel had a policy of de-developing the occupied territories. The agriculture was systematically either destroyed, Israel uprooted 1 million olive and fruit trees, or the agricultural economy was left very primitive and was made dependent on the Israeli market. 95% of Palestinian exports go to Israel, you know, at very reduced rates. Industry has never been able to develop. Israel has left a scorched earth. But at the same time, they locked the Palestinians out of the Israeli job market. Every day, until the early 1990s, 150,000 Palestinian workers would cross into Israel to work. And they were locked out beginning in 1993. One reason being that Israel discovered a cheaper source of labor. There are today 300,000 foreign workers in Israel that are imported from China, Thailand, the Philippines, Romania, West Africa, and they've replaced the Palestinian population. Today, the Palestinians live on, 70% of the Palestinians live on less than $2 a day. And they're kept alive by international relief. That's all. There is no Palestinian economy today. So that this is the result of the closure. And part of the closure is all these triangles here are checkpoints. There are 600 obstacles to movement in the occupied territories. And what's interesting is, wait, if this is security, only 17 checkpoints exist between Israel and the West Bank. The other, let's say, 587 or so are all inside the West Bank. Look at Jericho. Look what's going on around Jericho. Jericho is quieter than Portland. It's never had, I think, a terrorist attack in 40 years. It's far from Israel. There are no settlements to speak of around Jericho. 1 or 2 little tiny places, but nothing to speak of. And yet, look at the checkpoints. Jericho is completely surrounded by a trench, so people cannot drive in and out of the city. Why? Where's the security in here? That's the second element. And this has to do with house demolitions, because Israel is trying to confine the Palestinians to areas A and B even though the Palestinians' land, the land they own, that they can build houses on for their children, are mainly in Area C. So when a Palestinian comes to get a building permit to build a house on his or her own land in Area C, Israel says no. It refuses to give building permits because Israel has zoned the entire West Bank as agricultural land. And therefore, it says, sorry, but this is agricultural land. But when we want to build one of our 300 settlements, we simply rezone from agriculture to residential. It's a very sophisticated system of zoning, planning, law, a Kafkaesque bureaucracy that's laid over the Palestinians. And just to give you a little tiny hint of this is the Shawamri family. Salim and Arabiya Shawamri and their 6 kids in the village of Anata near Jerusalem. Salim bought a little piece of land in the village of Anata, which is today in Area C, applied 4 times for a building permit to the Israeli authorities, what we call the civil administration, Israel's military government, and was refused all 4 times because it's agricultural land. Each time it cost him $5,000 to apply. Finally, like thousands of other Palestinian families, Salim had to build a small house he had nowhere else to go. Had to build a house for his family. And immediately he got a demolition order. Nevertheless, the family, like thousands of others, lived in their home for 5 years before one day in July 1998, the family was having lunch and they heard a knock on the door. Salim opens the door, and here are, now I don't know what civil servants look like in Portland. This is what civil servants look like serving the Palestinians in the West Bank. This is Rami, and this is Micha, the inspectors of the civil administration. Civil administration, because Israel is trying to lower its military profile and hire civilians to give the impression that everything is normal, routine, just banal, everyday administration. The irony is that the civil administration is located in the center of the West Bank. So what Israeli civilians can go work there? Settlers. So Rami and Micha are settlers living on land taken from Palestinians who are now in a position to decide what Palestinians can have a home and whose home's going to be demolished. Salim opens the door and Rami says to him, "Is this your house?" And Salim says, "Yes, it's my house." He says, "No, it isn't. It's our house now. You got 15 minutes to take out all your belongings. We're going to demolish it." Now, what would you do? I mean, a normal human reaction isn't to say, "Dear, would you please help me carry out the dining room table?" You would resist. You'd yell, "It's your home." And when that happens, it turns into resistance. And Salim was beaten and thrown out of the house. Tear gas was thrown into the home. Here's his wife Arabiya being taken out on a stretcher. The children running and screaming all over. Salim lying on the ground, not able to do anything. And here's where we come into the story. You know, we've taken the issue of house demolitions as our vehicle for resisting the occupation. You know that Israel's demolished 18,000 Palestinian homes in the occupied territory since 1967. And like this case, there's no security element here. Salim's not a terrorist. He's never been charged with anything. So it raises the question, why is Israel demolishing this family's home if it isn't security? And there we get into the proactive elements of the Israeli occupation. It's doing so to contain the Palestinians in these little islands so the rest of the land can be annexed. So we resist demolitions. As Israeli Jews, we're in a privileged position. They're not going to shoot us, they're not going to beat us. They'll arrest us all the time, but they're not going to put us in jail. so we can resist in ways that Palestinians can't. So we chain ourselves in the houses. We get arrested. Next time you think you had a hard day at the office, look at my day in the office. And then finally, and this is Rabbi Arik Asherman, who I know has been in Portland before, from an organization called Rabbis for Human Rights. 100 Israeli rabbis that are on our board of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, and comes out with me and gets arrested as well. He just got beaten up last week by settlers, Arik. And finally, when we're out of the house, the family's out of the house, the civil administration subcontracts to commercial wrecking companies to demolish the homes. So the owners of the companies, the Israeli owners, send in, this is a foreign worker, this is a Romanian worker, send him in, they say, rip out get all the stuff out, you got 5 minutes. So imagine someone coming into your home and ripping everything out. Everything is torn out, as you can see. And the papers are scattered all over, your pictures, your documents, everything. Your home is your most sacred, intimate space. Everything is thrown out. It's a complete financial ruin, not to mention the trauma and the violence of demolitions. And finally, the bulldozer comes to demolish the house. And here there are tragedies within tragedies within tragedies. The driver of the bulldozer is a Palestinian. You know, he's a guy that happens to work for this company. So one morning he reports to work and the owner says, you're going to go build a road. The next morning he reports to work and the owner says, I have a contract with the civil administration to demolish houses. You're going to go out and demolish houses today. And this happened to be a fellow that knew Salim, and yet had to demolish the house. And finally, the house is demolished, and you can imagine what. And this is repeated 18,000 times and counting. Every single day there are house demolitions, and not only in the occupied territories, this is true inside Israel as well, for the Arab population of Israel. And finally, the house is demolished. So another form of resistance that we do is to rebuild homes that have been demolished. And we have house parties. We're going to have one, I think, tomorrow here in Portland. We raise money from people like you. We raise money and we rebuild houses, demolished houses, as political acts of resistance, not humanitarian. And we bring internationals. If anybody's interested, the last 2 weeks of July every year, we have a summer work camp in Anata, based in Seaman Arabia's house. There's so many demolitions in Anata, and we go out, we have a special relationship with that place, and we rebuild homes. So internationals, as you're all called in our lingo, and Israelis and Palestinians join together to rebuild homes that have been demolished. Here's Arabia between two Israeli women rebuilding her home. So it's not only a political act or an act of solidarity, but you know, for Palestinians who are scared, intimidated, financially ruined, threatened, you know, to have Israelis come out and to do something constructive like rebuild the home, even though the threat of demolition again remains over the home, is something that's very meaningful. In the end, I won't go, I have everything documented, I won't do it tonight. Seaman Arabia's home was demolished 4 times and rebuilt each time by our committee and by our Palestinian partners. Today the home still stands, but 3 weeks ago Selim lost his second appeal to the Supreme Court to cancel the demolition order and allow him to build a house. And now we're going to the international courts. Judge Juan Guzman, who's the Chilean judge who brought Pinochet to trial in Spain, is going to take Seaman Arabia's case. And we're going to the courts in Spain, again, to try to challenge the entire policy of house demolitions, which is illegal in international law. Now, to finish up, just to finish up the picture, the third element of the matrix of control are the settlement blocks that Israel has declared that it wants to keep at any price. When Barak went to the Camp David, to the final status meeting in Camp David, he had to define Israel's bottom line. What do we want to keep in any peace agreement with the Palestinians? And there are 7 settlement blocks, these pink areas, that Israel wants to keep. One is the Jordan Valley. Israel will not allow an unsupervised border between a Palestinian state and an Arab state. The Ariel block is number 2, that divides the West Bank east and west and sits atop the largest water aquifer in the West Bank. The Modi'in block is the 3rd, around the city of Modi'in. And Upper Modi'in is the largest settlement in the West Bank, and this altogether is being built as the largest city in Israel, Modi'in, that sits on top of some of the richest agricultural land that the Palestinians have. And then there are 3 blocks that make up what we call Greater Jerusalem: Givat Ze'ev, Ma'ale Adumim, and the Etzion block. And so Jerusalem these are being annexed to Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is being transformed from a city into a region. And this is especially important because the World Bank estimates that 40% of the Palestinian economy revolves around Jerusalem. This is especially where tourism is, which is potentially the largest Palestinian industry. So by taking Greater Jerusalem out of any Palestinian state, we're essentially removing the economic heart of any Palestinian state. The 4th element in the matrix of control is the infrastructure. I won't get into that now. 29 major highways, Israel-only highways. And if this isn't apartheid, I don't know what is. Highways that link the settlements to Israel, Israel-only highways, and Palestinians have to find their ways in dirt roads all around the country to try to get from place to place. All of these highways were built with American money during the Oslo peace process. So at the same time we're negotiating land, sovereignty, Jerusalem, water, borders, Israel doubles its settler population and builds an entire network of bypass roads. And finally, the last element in the matrix of control is the wall, what we call the separation barrier. And the concept of the wall is not security. If it's a byproduct, that's fine. The wall is a demographic wall of separation, and it's intended to be a political border between Israel and the Palestinian Bantustan that emerges. And we use the apartheid language in a very precise and I think in a clarifying kind of a way. And this is what Condoleezza Rice is cooking up with Tzipi Livni. Yesterday, when I wrote the article about the Livni-Rice plan, nobody knew who Tzipi Livni was. Today, she's in all the newspapers because she's probably going to replace Ulmert as prime minister. Today, everybody almost knows who Tzipi Livni is. She's the foreign minister, and she and Condoleezza Rice are cooking up a convergence plan, a plan of apartheid. And this is what's going to happen in the next few weeks, if not maybe in the next couple months. And the plan is to declare a provisional Palestinian state, a state with no borders, with no economy, with no functioning government, with no resources, a provisional Palestinian state, in a sense to freeze the Palestinians in a kind of limbo between occupation and statehood, in which the wall becomes the eastern demographic border of Israel. So the wall will be declared the provisional border of Israel, and the settlement blocks will be annexed to Israel. But Israel will have a second eastern border. It's going to be the only country in the world with 2 eastern borders. This is our demographic border, but the Jordan River is Israel's security border. And between these two eastern borders, now you can begin to see the cantons. And this is what Sharon called his cantonization plan. You can see the cantons of the emerging Palestinian Bantustan. To the north of the West Bank, the center, the south, and then Gaza. And the Palestinians are, and then Israel will, it's true, remove the little settlements from deep within these cantons, converge them or move them into the settlement blocks, and then declare the occupation's over. Just like we did in Gaza, right? We moved our settlers, we moved the army, there's no more occupation in Gaza. I mean, Gaza is a cage, nobody can move, there's starvation in Gaza, but we're not there. In international law, the occupation still exists in Gaza. Occupation is defined as having effective control over a territory. But the same argument's going to be used here. There's no more occupation. We're out of the areas that have been declared the provisional Palestinian state. And this is the Palestinian nightmare, is to be trapped in this limbo in which there's no more occupation, there's no real Palestinian state, and this provisional situation can last forever. And what Condoleezza Rice says is, this is where we're going, and we'll leave it to the next administration to determine the actual boundaries. Well, we know what that means. And just to give you for a minute a picture of the wall, because Israel prefers to call it a fence, the wall is 26 feet high. It's more than twice as high as the Berlin Wall was. The Berlin Wall was 12 feet high. The Israeli wall is 7 times longer than the Berlin Wall, and it's not linear. I'll show you in a minute. Here, for example, it completely surrounds, this is the city of Tulkarm, of 70,000 people, completely surrounded by the wall. And the wall does not separate Israelis from Palestinians, which you would think it would do if it's a security barrier. Instead, as you can see, the wall is built within Palestinian communities, dividing Palestinian communities, partly because Israel builds a wall in a way that the Israeli population can't see it. You know, Jews don't have great associations with walls. So the wall is built deep in Palestinian areas where the Israeli Jewish population can't see it. So here's a Palestinian grandmother in Bethlehem looking over where her grandchildren live in Beit Jala on the other side, separated by the wall. And the wall is not linear like the Berlin Wall is, but it encompasses, or it encloses tens of thousands of Palestinians in enclaves, closed enclaves. Only around Jerusalem, 55,000 Palestinians are going to be enclosed in ghettos like this in Abu Dis. And here's a picture of the wall that goes through Abu Dis. Now, there's no Israelis within miles of this picture on either side. There is absolutely no security element at all in this wall. The wall here is completely as a political border going through Abu Dis. And you know how we get all upset when we talk about boycotts of Israel, and especially academic boycotts? Well, this is Al-Quds University. The wall goes through the campus of the university, preventing faculty and students from getting to classes. So we have not only a boycott, but a wall going through imagine a wall going through a campus here in the United States. This should be an issue of every American university, because it isn't only Al-Quds University, the wall going through the campus. And then it's true, in the rural areas, it is a fence, an electrified fence, as you can see, but still a massive barrier. Why, you know, it's obvious that Israel prefers you to say fence rather than wall, because a fence sounds nicer, it's more minimal. It has a nicer connotation. But it's really a massive barrier. Look, you have the fence, you have 2 patrol roads, this is a military vehicle, and then you have trenches on each side, and then another fence. Now multiply this by about 400 miles. And this is going through some of the richest agricultural land. Look, this is an olive orchard. You see the way, you see here the way that the contour of the hill was? And it continues here, and here the trees continue. So multiply this by hundreds of miles, and the environmental damage is tremendous. I mean, look at the swath of land, and with all due respect, this is not Minnesota. This is the Holy Land. This is a place that's sacred and important to all humankind. It's a human heritage place. If there's ever anything is a human heritage place, it's the Holy Land. And look what's happening. I mean, this issue goes way beyond simply the issue of security and violations of Palestinian rights. It goes into what we're doing to the Holy Land. All right, and finally, all right, these are some other pictures, but I want just one more, just to summarize, just in one more slide. This is where we're going. We're heading towards a Bantustan. In other words, something far from even the minimal two-state solution that is accepted pretty much by everyone except the Israeli governments who created these irreversible facts on the ground. And this is apartheid. Apartheid is not specific to South Africa. It's a system that can be exported. And it means essentially the separation of populations, which is what Israel calls its policy, hafradah in Hebrew, separation, and then where one population permanently and institutionally dominates another. And this is where we're going, and I think it's the end of the two-state solution, and now we're really in a mess. If the two-state solution is gone, and the one-state solution, and it's ironic that Israel itself has made this one state, sees it as one country, but can't go there because if we give Palestinian citizenship, it's not a Jewish state anymore. We're really trapped. And where do we go from there? I'm playing with the idea of a Middle East confederation, but we're really in a very difficult situation. Our job is to end the occupation and as much as we can, and to try to prepare the way for a just peace. And we have to do this not only because we care about Palestinians, but I think because we care about Israel, and we care about the United States and the rest of the world. Because if you remember the Baker-Hamilton report of a couple months ago, James Baker himself, the Republican Secretary of State, says that this conflict is the epicenter. You are not going to get on with business as usual in any of the Middle East. You are not going to find an accommodation with the Muslim world. You're not going to advance, let's say, in the war on terrorism. You are not going to bring stability to the world unless this conflict is resolved. So it's a global conflict that has tremendous implications, and especially for Americans, because I submit to you that the occupation is not seen by the Muslim and wider worlds as an Israeli occupation. It's seen as an American Israeli occupation. And the United States is very complicit in this. I'll leave it at that. I'm sorry I talked so long.
You've been watching a lecture by Jeff Halper, the Executive Director of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. In a moment, we'll return to an extended question and answer segment of the program. The Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions is a nonviolent, direct action organization originally established to oppose and actively resist Israeli demolition of Palestinian homes in the occupied territories. Their resistance activities have grown to oppose land expropriation, settlement expansion, bypass road construction, the policies of closure and separation, the wholesale uprooting of fruit and olive trees, and other dimensions of the Israeli occupation. To find out more about the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, please visit their website at www.icahd.org. And now we return to the question and answer segment of our program with Jeff Halper. The first question from the audience had two parts. With regard to the role or responsibility of the peace movement to work for an end to the occupation, this seems to imply a recognition of the two-state solution, because if you are not working for a two-state solution, then the occupation would seem to be something other than an occupation. You would be working instead for common citizenship in a single state. Does working for an end to the occupation imply working for a two-state solution? The second question is about Jeff Halper's mention of the need to recognize the right of self-determination of two peoples. Are those two peoples Israeli Arabs, people who are ethnically Palestinian, and the residents of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank? Or were you referring to Jews and non-Jews?
Okay. All right, all right. You know, we've always supported, in principle, the two-state solution, because we do talk about the self-determination of two peoples. By peoples, we mean Palestinians and Israelis, not necessarily the Jewish people, because most Jews don't consider themselves Israelis, but the self-determination of peoples in Israel-Palestine. I mean, the problem I just brought up is, what do we do if the two-state solution's been rendered impossible? Not because we don't want the two-state solution, but because it's gone under the matrix of control. Now where do we go? And I mean, there's two alternatives. One is a one-state solution. In other words, one democratic state. But here you're right, and the problem is then there's no self-determination, not for the Palestinians and not for the Israelis. And the history of binational states is not a happy history, because nations are not ethnic groups. Self-determination is a basic requirement of a nation, rather than an ethnic group, which is a cultural group that lives with other cultural groups within a common state. In other words, in the United States, you have ethnic groups, except maybe the Native Americans, that actually have the status, you know, of nations. I mean, it's very problematic, but the United States does recognize the Native Americans as nations. But otherwise, the United States has a common American neutral. I mean, there are some people who would like it to be a white Christian Aryan nation, but nevertheless, it's a neutral American identity, and then ethnic groups, each one keeping its language or its cultures or its religions, its own cultural identity, but are ethnic, that accept nationally you're Americans, and ethnically you're hyphenated American. You're Jewish Americans, Asian Americans, African Americans, whatever. In Israel and in most of the world, Israel and Palestine and most of the world, peoples are nations. That's a problem in Iraq with the Kurds and so on. And so nations don't share common states because there's no overarching identity. Each nation wants its own self-determination. And so binational states aren't very happy states. So I don't know if the one-state solution is really a viable option. And therefore, so if the two-state solution's gone, the one-state solution won't work, where are we? I'm not going to get into the whole thing now, but what I'm sort of suggesting is to look at what I call a two-state plus model. In other words, in Israel-Palestine, integrated within a wider economic union, or not a union, a confederation of Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. So that the Palestinians need two things. They need self-determination and they need viability. Because it doesn't help them to get a state if it's a Bantustan and it's a prison state, and so what? That doesn't really help. They need economic viability, but they can't get it together. And so what you can say to the Palestinians is, take the Bantustan. Take it. That's all you're going to get. You are not going to get a viable state. You can get something. Take it, because at least that gives you political identity. on condition, and this should be written in blood by the international community, on condition that within, let's say, 10 years, a Middle East economic confederation will emerge, so that Palestinians can live as Palestinian citizens anywhere in this confederation. Anybody can live anywhere they want to, Israelis or Syrians. Like in Europe, it's the European model, essentially. So what you're doing is you're saying to the Palestinians, you can have your self-determination, you can have your state, but you're not locked into it. In terms of viability, you have the entire confederation that you can live in and work in, and you can have a future. In other words, it's a regional approach. And I think it's too early to advocate for this, but as the two-state solution closes down, I think as Condoleezza Rice and Tzipi Livni cook up their plans, I think it's going to be, as the Palestinians see that the two-state solution is gone, I think people will start casting around for another alternative, and maybe this idea of the two-state plus a confederation idea, I mean, I think it offers a new way of thinking, a way to think out of the box.
The next question had 4 parts. First, there's the concern that there be a refuge for Jews, concern that there needs to be a Jewish state. Throughout Jewish history, whenever Jews have allowed themselves to feel part of any country, whether Germany or Russia, things have changed. Jews have suffered discrimination and pogroms, culminating in the Holocaust. So it's important to have a place to go. How would you address this need? The second question has to do with the role of the Arab world, the other states of the region, and the problem of the right of return for the Palestinian people. How would you address the differences in birth rates of the two peoples? These factors suggest that it is inevitable that after a few generations there won't be a two-state solution. A third question regards Hamas. How would you appeal to a group like Hamas? The final question, why have the Gulf states only contributed to the Intifada, the uprising and resistance to occupation, and never to building the infrastructure for the Palestinian people?
Okay. A couple simple questions. Look, let me try to address those in a wider kind of a framework. First of all, to tell you the honest truth, since I am in this place, I don't think that Israel's going to remain a Jewish state forever. I don't think it's tenable. And I moved to Israel. I mean, obviously, I do see a genuine tie between the Jewish people and Israel. I don't see myself as a colonial transplant into Palestine. Nevertheless, you know, partly because the Jews of the world aren't going to come to Israel. You know, I know everybody has this idea that, you know, we need an Israel because we might need a refuge someday. Believe me, if there's a crisis in the world, the Jews are not going to go to Israel. They'll go somewhere else. I mean, but I'm serious. I mean, whenever Jews had a choice, they didn't come to Israel, including my wife's parents. My wife's, all her aunts and uncles after the Holocaust. The Jews, for example, that left Russia, that left the Soviet Union, came to the United States. And it got to a point where Shamir, our prime minister, had to implore Bush, the father, to close the United States to Russian Jewry, because the Jews were coming here and not coming to Israel. And he closed the United States, and what happened is they started to go to Germany. You have a huge Russian Jewish population in Germany, so Sharon, about 4 years ago, implored Schroeder to close Germany to Jews. So the Russian Jews you have in Israel are really there because they're trapped. And in a way, I think Israel is going to be a way station. 60,000 Russian Jews have left in the last 4 or 5 years. So that the Jews of South Africa, when they're leaving South Africa, they're coming here, or they're going to Australia. The Jews of Iran went to California. You know, the Jews of Argentina, when the economy collapsed, went to Mexico. I mean, there's always a few maybe nutty ones like me that go to Israel. But the vast majority don't. When the Jews left North Africa, the middle-class Jews went to France. The majority of French Jews today are North African, or they went to Quebec and French-speaking Canada. It was only the poor people that Israel was able to import from North Africa, for the most part. The Jews that left Iraq, the middle classes went to England. And it was the poorer people, especially the Kurdish Jews, that came to Israel. That repeats itself. So I'm not so sure that Israel is really the place where Jews will flock to. I think they'd flock to Australia and Italy and other places before Israel. I think that's one issue. The other issue is that Israel is again, it's true. There's a growing Arab population. I mean, Israel was not a barren country. And now, the refugee issue, I don't think is a major issue, to tell you the truth, because all the polls, and there's been some interesting studies done that say that only about 10% of the refugees would in fact come back into Israel, and most of them are older people. I think the problem is demographic from an internal point of view, in terms of the Jews are leaving Israel. We have a negative emigration rate. When you hear about the Jewish population of Israel, Israel does not include emigration. Jews are not coming to Israel. And so you're going to have a more of a normal type of an evolution in which the Jews become, if a majority at all, a slim majority. So that's what I'm saying about relating to Israel as a real country. There's no way that we can artificially create or perpetuate an Israel that's Jewish, as much as we might want a Jewish Israel, because that's just simply not the way things are going. And so Israel has to make peace with its neighbors, and I think it can. I think Hamas is not really the spokesperson of the Palestinians. In the first Palestinian elections in 1996, 95-96, the Hamas got less than 10% of the vote. Hamas is a protest vote. Hamas is a vote for a movement with backbone, and the feeling was that Fatah was giving in to the Israelis, and it was corrupt. But I don't think it really represents the Palestinian people, who are in fact the most secular and educated of all the Arab peoples. So, we get these distortions. But I think once we begin to get into a normal situation, those kinds of things will resolve themselves. Just your last point is this issue of normalization is important. A lot of people say, well, why haven't the Palestinians invested in infrastructure? Why haven't they developed Gaza into a Singapore? Israel's not there. There's an issue of normalization. And that is that the Palestinians are in a struggle for their liberation. And their fear is that if they stop resisting, and if they invest, they desperately want to invest in infrastructure and so on, but if everything becomes quiet and normal, and everything's invested, they'll never have their state. And therefore, they've made a decision to put off normalization until such a time as they have liberation. That's true of working with Israeli groups. We work with Palestinian groups in rebuilding homes. The Palestinians will not work with us if it's a matter of normalization. They don't want to work with Israeli groups on environmental issues, women's issues, health issues, education, because that's normalization, and they don't want normalization before liberation. I'll give you one just little example, it's very interesting. We always get permission from the local Palestinian communities before we build a home. We want to be sure that we're welcome. And for example, last summer in our work camp in Anata, the Fatah and even Hamas and the different factions in Anata said, yes, we welcome you to build a house, and it's a political act of solidarity. Great. One of our members is a juggler. And he said, you know what, in the work camp, I'll do a little workshop and I'll do some juggling for the kids. They said, no, that's normalization. We don't want that kind of normal relationship while there's still occupation. So I think it's a strategic decision on the part of the Palestinians. And, you know, you can argue about it, but that's the decision that they've made. You had a question before? Yeah.
The next question concerns the so-called Falasha Jews, Jews from Ethiopia, and other poor Jews. How are they treated in Israel, and are they trying to get out as fast as they can as well?
Well, you know, I did research in Ethiopia in the 60s. In 1966, I researched the Falashas, the Jews of Ethiopia. And I was the chairman of the Israeli Committee for Ethiopian Jews. I have my Zionistic sides too, that I don't always come out in lectures. The Ethiopian Jews are in a very difficult situation. There's about 70,000 Ethiopian Jews in Israel with an 80% unemployment rate. And what's happened to them is what we warned about already in the 70s, and that is that they were all channeled into the more marginal parts of the country. You know, the idea was that they were primitive, that you know, they didn't know how to use toilets, they ate with their hands, although everybody in the world pretty much eats with their hands, and now we're learning to eat hummus with our hands as well in Portland, but that was a terrible thing, to eat with their hands. And so it was decided not to settle them in cities, in places where there were jobs, but rather to put them in the more marginal, economically marginal areas of the country, and then to put them all in blocks, not to integrate them with the rest of the population. Until today, you have separate Ethiopian classrooms in Israeli schools. So that they've really become a kind of a pariah group. There's very interesting things happening. They have a whole club, an Ethiopian club. You know, there are thousands of Ethiopian kids, Ethiopian Jewish kids, that sleep in the Tel Aviv bus station. The Tel Aviv bus station is the largest bus station in the world. And they sleep around there. There's a lot of stores and corners, and there's a big discotheque called Soweto. And the Ethiopian Jewish kids are beginning to develop a kind of an African, American, Rastafarian, African identity, you know, that's very alienated from the Jewish identity of Israel. So here's a good example, for example, and it's not only the Ethiopians, it's true of other groups in Israel as well. The Russian Jews, for example, are not Israelizing very much and are beginning to leave the country. And that is that, you know, it's, you know, that to talk about Israel as a Jewish state papers over a lot of very real conflicts and differences in Israel. And, you know, those are some of the issues we're dealing with as well. The big issue inside Israel that's parallel to the occupation is, should Israel remain a Jewish country, or should it become a democracy, a state of all its citizens? And this is, of course, the issue of Israel as a state of all its citizens is being pushed by the 30% of Israelis who aren't Jewish, especially the Arab population. And I think eventually Israel is not going to be a Jewish state. But that's fine, because it doesn't mean, what I mean is it doesn't mean that the Jewish elements of Israel disappear. You know, when South Africa went to black majority rule, the whites didn't, the Afrikaners didn't disappear. You know, if Israel becomes a state of all its citizens, nobody's going to close the Hebrew University. People aren't going to stop speaking Hebrew. On the contrary, you know, the goal of Zionism in the early years was to reintegrate into the Middle East. The idea was that the Middle East is the hearth of Jewish civilization. I mean, before we were Jews, we were Iraqis way, way, way before we were Europeans. And to come back to our cultural hearth in the Middle East and to come home and to become Middle Easterners again. The early Zionists used to go around with keffiyehs and jalabiyas and all kinds of outfits, you know, because they wanted to be a part of the Middle East. So I think that process is going to happen. It's going to be a difficult process, but then we're going to go back to a model that's been known as cultural Zionism. In other words, political Zionism, I think, succeeded in creating the State of Israel, but it couldn't succeed in perpetuating the State of Israel, mainly because there aren't enough Jews in Israel. And there's not going to be enough Jews, I think. And so I think we'll have to go to a model of Israel as a democracy, and in which it has a very strong Zionist, Jewish, Israeli cultural and economic component to it, which I don't think is a terrible thing. We have a joke, by the way, that, you know, what if Israel does become one country in all the land of Israel with the Palestinians? What would it be called? And the joke is, I can tell the joke because I'm Jewish. Don't try it if you're not Jewish. But the answer is, we can call it Palestine. If we spell Stein, S-T-E-I-N. That's inclusive. All right, maybe we'll take one more question or so, and then I'll let you, or two or three. But I'll be brief, and then we'll try to leave in a couple minutes.
The next question asks about the impending global oil crisis, with prices rising to $200 a barrel or more, with the likelihood of transforming the entire world economy. This will affect Israel. Do you think this might be an impetus for some kind of Middle East federation?
Well, the issue is, you know, the question is, you know, could an oil crisis be an impetus to a confederation or to change? I mean, it's certainly possible. You know, I don't think the occupation is tenable. The situation in the Middle East, in Israel-Palestine, is not tenable. It's not sustainable. Where exactly the force is going to come from that changes it, I don't think we know. And that's why we're trying to fight the occupation, but we don't know exactly. I can't tell you, you know, where this force is going to come from. Israel looks very strong today. It has the United States behind it. It looks like this situation can last forever. Condoleezza Rice is cooking this thing up, but I don't think it can last. And oil or global warming or attack on Iran, or there are many other factors that we might not even connect up, I think can impact. I'll give you one little example. Israel withdrew from Gaza in what we call the disengagement, Sharon's disengagement from Gaza, on the basis of an American promise of $2 billion to fund the redeployment of the settlers, to resettle the settlers and redeploy the army. Israel withdrew. Just then Hurricane Katrina happens. And New Orleans drowned because Congress did not allocate $1.5 billion for a new levee system. So Sharon comes to collect his $2 billion, and Bush says to him, I can't give it to you. I can't give you $2 billion for Gaza when we let New Orleans drown for $1.5 billion. And Israel never got that money. Now that it was able to absorb. Whether they would have done that knowing they weren't going to get the money, I don't know. But they could absorb that. Israel has a fairly strong economy. But that's a micro example of how something completely disconnected and unexpected can impact. So who knows, a new tsunami, some global catastrophe. The United States today sees global warming as a security danger to the United States. I mean, a lot of things can happen, including an oil crisis. Who knows? That could change the situation. And what we're trying to argue is that Israel really is in a much more precarious situation than it thinks. Israel is has an arrogance of power. It's a very powerful country with the most powerful country behind it. But that can be a house of cards. And this system can collapse quickly. And what we're urging Israel to do, and those that support Israel to help with, is to is to grab the opportunities before we get into a situation of crisis. That Israel is still strong enough that it can achieve a just peace and stabilize its situation in the Middle East. If it waits much longer, I don't know what's going to happen. When I'll come here, and then you, and then we'll.
The next question is about Noam Chomsky's views on the basis for U.S. support for Israel. Basically, Chomsky believes that the U.S. supports Israel because Israel is doing the United States imperial bidding in the Middle East and elsewhere.
We call Israel America's largest aircraft carrier.
First of all, to what extent do you think that's true? And if it is true, then don't you think that the solution to the problem of the occupation will have to confront the United States' imperial ambitions?
No, this is a real issue. And again, I know it's late and I don't want to keep you all. But the whole issue of Israel's involvement with American empire, we all know that the neocons in Washington that have cooked this up are for the most part Jewish. Not all of them, but most of them are children of Norman Potterists. Elliot Abrams, who's the head of the Middle East desk of the National Security Council, is Pothoritz's son-in-law from Commentary magazine. And Wolfowitz and Feith and Pearl and all these guys. Wolfowitz, who was the Deputy Secretary of Defense, the architect of the Iraq War, today the beleaguered president of the World Bank, was Netanyahu's campaign manager in 1996. And Wolfowitz and Pearl and the same neocons that run Washington wrote the position paper called The Clean Break that you can look up on the internet that set out exactly Netanyahu's foreign policy towards the Palestinians, you know, and Israel becoming a kind of a hired gun for the United States in the Middle East. If you really want to see something scary and really understand the tremendous military involvement of Israel in the United States and how Israel sees itself as an extension of the American military, look up the AIPAC website. You know, AIPAC is the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, Israel's lobby in Washington. And they lay it all out in the clearest way. You can go with, there's a section called Security, and they lay out exactly how the United States and Israel are cooperating militarily in scary ways that you couldn't imagine. And especially in counterinsurgency. There's a whole other lecture in there that I won't go into today. So I think that Israel, in a sense, has harnessed itself to this terrible American empire idea. And in a way, it's you know, the whole idea of Zionism was that the Jews would have self-determination. And, you know, it was a radical idea in a way. You know, Israel, you know, Truman almost didn't recognize Israel because the State Department warned Truman that Israel was going to become a Soviet satellite because it was a very strong socialist country with very strong ties to the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe and so on. It wasn't always the way it is. And that was part of the idea of Zionism, to be self-determining. But Israel got hawked into this relation to the United States, this dependency that has really, in a sense, turned it into, really in a very dishonorable way, I think, into an extension of American empire. I have an article that's called Israel is an Extension of American Empire. And I think it is true, and I think Chomsky is right about that. And that's, again, where we have to reevaluate. I mean, what if we have a Jewish state, and that Jewish state is a militarized extension of neocon Washington? Is that worth anything? So, what is Jewish, I think, is important. All right, one more question, and then we'll...
The next question is about the prospects of a two-state solution bringing an end to the violence. How would you rate the likelihood of eliminating tit-for-tat violence? Since a two-state solution isn't going to happen overnight, how could you safeguard against violence by Palestinians?
Right. We look at terrorism, that's another whole issue. We don't use the word terrorism because it's a pretty loaded term. But attacks on civilians are completely prohibited, whether it's a state or non-state actors. But we see terrorism, let's call it, as a symptom. And this has to do with the framing as well, because obviously the United States, the Bush administration, is trying to present terrorism as an independent variable. It's a clash of civilizations. You have Islamophobia. That's the way the Arabs are. All that, and therefore terrorism is simply the way they are. And the problem with that view, and you have that in Israel on the part of the government, is it disempowers the people. Because what the Israeli leaders are telling their people is that there is no political solution. That's just the way the Arabs are. There's no partner for peace. They're going to throw us into the sea. And so the Israeli public, that's one reason why they say we'd love to give up the occupation, but we can't, because if we do, they'll throw us into the sea. It's a closed circle, a circle like that. What we argue is that terrorism or resistance or violence or whatever you want to call it is a symptom of the conflict. It's a form of resistance, whether or not you consider it a legitimate resistance or not. And you know, the Palestinians have never been known in history as violent. You know, they're not the Mongols. The Palestinians never conquered Austria. I mean, they're a normal, quiet, agricultural people. So if there's terrorism today, if the young people have been made so angry and alienated and brutalized, it's obviously because of the conflict and the occupation. So our view is, if you end the occupation and if you allow reconciliation and healing to take place and economic development, that those forms of violence will end. Okay? One more little, okay. Say it.
The next question has to do with the matrix of control. If there is to be a viable two-state solution on 22% of the land, the Saudi program, what the United Nations has agreed to, doesn't that necessitate the elimination of the matrix of control? And isn't the federal solution that you discussed this evening leave in place the matrix of control?
That's right. No, look, and then I'll really let you go. No, we support the two-state idea as an idea. The two-state solution was always the left-wing solution. In other words, 15, 20 years ago, I couldn't have gone into the Federation or into a synagogue and support a two-state solution. That was absolute, that was taboo, that was terrible. Today you can't go into the Federation unless you sign a piece of paper that you do support the two-state solution. So it used to be the solution of the left and of the peace movement and of the Palestinians. What I'm saying is that it's gone. That two-state solution, the two-state solution of a Palestinian state alongside Israel, a viable Palestinian state, is gone because of the matrix of control. Because there's no Israeli government that would have the strength, the power to do that. You know, we have governments that are coalition governments that are very weak. For example, in our parliament, which is 120 members, to set up a government you need at least 61, 62, 63 seats, right? A little bit more than a majority. The largest party in the Knesset is Kadima of Ulmert, that has 29 seats. The largest party has 29 seats, and all the other parties have 18 and 10 and 6 and 3. So there's no way that you could cobble together a government that, if it wanted to even, would be able to dismantle this matrix of control. The wall is a $2 to $3 billion, a massive enterprise. The settlements are 500,000 people. Look what Sharon had to do to get 7,000 out of Gaza. And we simply think that there is no power on the part of Israel And there's no will on the part of the government either to dismantle the matrix of control. It's dismantleable. I agree it's dismantleable. I mean, much larger populations were moved around in Europe after World War II. 500,000 people is not a lot of people objectively, and you could rebuild and resettle for them in Israel and so on. What's missing is the will in Israel, the political clout of any government that would attempt to do that, that simply couldn't marshal the strength to do that, and the lack of will on the part of the international community to force Israel to do that. I'll tell you just in a word what my formula is. You know, the conflict could be ended tomorrow morning. And this is what most Israelis would love, and I'll leave you with this. You know, Bush likes to be the cowboy, and it would really fit. It would be something that I could envision him doing. He's not going to, but I could envision it. If Bush, this is the formula. If Bush would get up and say tomorrow morning, we love Israel. I mean, first of all, you got to tell Israelis you love them. Otherwise, you know, you're anti-Semitic and so you've got to reassure them that we love you. We love you, okay. We will absolutely guarantee your security. You can be a part of NATO. We have a strategic alliance with Israel. We'll send American troops. You can become a part of the European Union. Whatever you want, Israel, in which you feel that your security is guaranteed, you have it. Europe will guarantee it, the UN will guarantee it, the United States will guarantee it. Take security out of the equation. You are secure. Third, now the occupation's over, period. In 6 months, you guys are out of the, or in a year or whatever, you're out of the occupied territories. If Bush would do say those three things, you would have dancing in the streets of Tel Aviv. That's exactly what the Israeli public wants. It can't get it. The Israeli government won't say it. Other governments won't, so the Israeli people are stuck. That's what they want. That's their idea of a miracle, that someone will come and free them of this damn occupation. And that's the formula. But that's not going to happen. And instead, we end up, as we all know, strengthening the occupation in all kinds of ways. So that's why I say the two-state solution is functionally gone, and that's why I'm talking about a Middle East confederation. Thank you for having me.
You've been watching a lecture by Jeff Halper, the Executive Director of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. To find out more about the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, please visit their website at www.icahd.org. This program has been produced by PDxJustice Media Productions. To find out more about this program and other video and audio programs in our library, please visit our website at www.pdxjustice.org. Thank you for watching, and thank you for supporting listener-sponsored radio, public access television, net neutrality, and all forms of grassroots democratic community media.
Israel was hostile towards Yiddish. Do you know that after the Holocaust, there were many very famous Yiddish actors that survived, that came to Israel? Do you know that into the 1960s, the late 1960s, it was illegal in Israel to perform a play in Yiddish? You would be arrested. And they had a very vibrant Yiddish theater in Israel. And what did they do? They would advertise a play at 8 o'clock, and all the Yiddish-speaking Jews knew that the play was really going to be on at 6. And by the time the police came at 8 to arrest everybody, the play would be over. You know, and this was in Israel. There was a tremendous hostility, and you still have remnants of that today. A hostility to anything that reeked of the diaspora, the exile, ghettos, Jews living in other people's countries, anything that wasn't Zionistic. And I think what happened was that the Jews here in the United States, in Europe, in the rest of the world after World War II, began to adopt an Israel-centric definition of Judaism. In other words, to some degree they accepted that, partly because there were very few alternatives, because again, Jewish life had been destroyed in its traditional heartlands. And so you began to have a vicarious identification of Judaism with Israel. And Israel became, you know, the linchpin of American, and not only American, but largely American Jewish identity, so that everything was galvanized around Israel. And this is where the Jewish community found its meaning and was able to organize. So that, and the Israel that they constructed as this center pin of their lives was a very idealized Israel. Thank you all, and it's good to be here in the Neve Shalom Synagogue. This issue is very emotional and controversial, and it's not always my privilege to be in a synagogue. So you know, it means a lot to me to be able to be here. You know, I was scheduled to speak in the Jewish Federation in Salt Lake City, of all places. Salt Lake City has a Jewish community, and you know, they always joke that if you really want to be a Gentile, go to Salt Lake City, because the Jews there are Gentiles. So I was scheduled to speak in the Federation, and then we arrived, and the Federation discovered who I was too late to cancel. So I got there, and they basically wouldn't let me in. Okay. The next year I came back to Salt Lake City, and a Jewish group there had organized for me to speak in one of the Jewish schools. And at the last minute that was canceled with pressures from whoever in the Jewish community. So one of the members of the Jewish community, a very prominent doctor, and I say that because people don't want to relate to Israel as a real place. And I think if I can say this, in terms of the Jewish community, I think in a sense, one reason why it's very hard to engage with the Jewish community on this issue isn't because of the issue itself. I think most American Jews want peace. They want good for Israel. I don't think they want the settlements. I don't think they want the occupation. I don't think that's the issue. The issue is that Israel and Zionism did a real disservice to the Jewish people, I think. And that is, you know, in the Holocaust, a lot of the Jewish life of the diaspora was destroyed. And in that kind of a vacuum, Zionism arose as a very strong force. Before World War II, Zionism was not an accepted force, as you well know. In the Reform, for example, Reform and conservative communities, Jewish communities in the United States, they were anti-Zionist. up until 1948 and many after 1948. Even in the very beginning, Theodor Herzl, why was the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland? Because the Jewish community in Zurich wouldn't allow it to be in Zurich. The Jewish community never, ever really supported Zionism. And I would say that until today, 75%, the revolution of Zionism was to redefine the Jewish people as a nation, like the French nation, like the British nation, like the Russians, the Chinese. In other words, nations that have rights of self-determination. And that's the basis of being Israeli. But the vast, vast majority of Jews never went there. Only 1% of American Jews ever went to Israel, moved to Israel. As a matter of fact, before this birthright program, where we have to bring young people to Israel for free, or else they won't come, 85% of American Jews had never visited Israel. In other words, there's a very interesting paradox here that the real country of Israel is not of great interest to American Jews, or even to Jews outside. In some ways, it is a foreign country. But at the same time, I think what happened with the destruction of European Jewry was that Zionism kind of leaped into the breach. It was the only real organized Jewish movement in many ways. And again, many of the Jews in this country that didn't go through the Holocaust, were socialists, communists. Without the Jews, there wouldn't have been a Communist Party, probably here or anywhere else in the world. And then after World War II, and especially in the 50s with the rise of McCarthyism and so on, that whole Jewish leftist tradition was also suppressed. So you had the suppression of the Jewish world of Europe, or the destruction of the Jewish world of Europe, and the suppression of one of the major expressions of Jewish social conscience in the West, and in the United States in particular, which was socialism and communism and radical social movements. And so Zionism kind of filled that breach. But Zionism, one part of Zionism, there's an element of Zionism that's what's called the negation of the exile. In other words, Jews that live in this country, including my parents, for example, I don't think see themselves as living in exile. My parents are living in a diaspora, maybe, but they're Americans. And they're American Jews. And they're proud of being Jewish and so on. And Judaism has different expressions, but they're Americans. But what Israel told Jews in the diaspora was, your life is ephemeral in the exile. You're living in other people's countries. Your life has no meaning whatsoever outside of Israel. There's no Jewish culture, certainly not Yiddish. They're very prominent in the community. Basically called the leaders of the Jewish community into his home for a meeting. I was there. And he's prominent enough that they couldn't say no to him. And he brought in the leaders of the Federation. He brought in the Hillel people from the different universities. He brought in rabbis from the various synagogues with the question, and this was really, I thought, brilliant. The question he posed to them was, why can't we talk about Israel? Why can't we talk about Israel? Why can't Jeff Halper, who is today an Israeli, I've been in Israel now for 35 years, why can't Jeff Halper speak in the Jewish, but not just Jeff Halper, anybody with a peace message can't. Because of course, I'm not balanced and I'm, all that. Well, that's probably true, but my presentation isn't balanced. And at the same time, of course, in the Jewish federations and so on, Daniel Pipes can speak. People that, Netanyahu can speak in Vancouver. In other words, people that represent the right wing and even an Islamophobic position can speak freely in the Jewish community. But people that come with a more nuanced message of peace are locked out. And that, I thought, was an interesting way to approach it. The question is, why can't we talk about Israel? And what I want to start with is kind of a funny thing to say. But, you know, Israel is a real country. You know, it's not just a construct. It's not just a projection of the Jewish community here. It isn't Leon Uris and Exodus. And it never was. It isn't Golda Meir. It isn't the kibbutz. It isn't a lot of blonde-haired farmers and so on. Israel's a real country. There's all kinds of people living there. You know, the Jewish majority is now only 70% in Israel. So 30% of Israelis are not Jewish. It's a very vibrant country. It's a very conflicted country. It's a very interesting country, very dynamic.